Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're continuing with our ongoing series entitled The QME's Championship Playbook. And we're now in part 3 of this program entitled Report Writing Secrets of the Masters. And our topic today is how to present your QME report as a masterpiece. And as we reviewed in our last section, we stated that you should never ever send in your QME report until you're absolutely convinced that your report is perfect in every single way. There are no typos, there are no formatting errors, there are no misuses of him, her, pronouns, he, she, his, and hers. And the spacing should all be symmetric throughout the entirety of the report. And the report should be visually appealing, and it should be your masterpiece that represents you as your work product out in the workplace. And in our last session, I talked about how to make your QME report comply with all the labor codes and regulations that govern, number one, the physical examination, in other words, the face-to-face meeting with the examinee, and then number two, the laws and regulations that govern the writing and the submission of your QME report. And in our last session, we talked about how to demonstrate to the parties your compliance with California Code of Regulation 34, California Code of Regulation 35.5, and also California Code of Regulation 9795, all of those within the introductory section of your report. Let me say that again. We showed you in our last session how to demonstrate to the parties that you know the rules and that you complied with all the rules that govern your evaluation. Specifically, in the introductory section of the report, I showed you how to demonstrate to the parties your compliance with CCR 34, CCR 35.5, and CCR 9795. We talked about some ways to format the report so that it's visually appealing and that it looks like a cohesive and well-organized work product to the eye of the reader. Now, in today's discussion, I want to continue our philosophy, and that is how to present your report as a masterpiece. And we're talking here not so much how to come up with the opinions and conclusions of the report. We're simply talking in this program how to create a QME report that's visually appealing and attractive to the eye of the reader. We're talking about how your report looks in this section. So we talked about how to format page 1 and page 2 of your report in our last session. And today I want to pick up beginning with the content of the report now in the history section and talk about all of the sections or all of the elements or all of the report elements that are required to be in your QME report. In other words, what are the major subject headings that are required by law, or at least by recommendation through the 2016 Physician's Guide and also the AMA guides? What are the report format elements that you should include in your report, and what are some of the report format elements that you can safely exclude from your report without in any way diminishing the quality of the opinions and conclusions in your report? Now, I must mention that many doctors are using report writing software that is not customized to the California Workers' Compensation system. And I was reviewing a doctor's report yesterday, and he had so many subject headings in the report that it was confusing to the reader what's a major heading and what is not a major heading. It seemed like everything was turned into a major heading, and the report was just overladen with bold subject headings, many of which can be combined into one singular subject heading to improve the readability of the report, to improve the flow of the report, and to improve the visual appeal of the report. As we know, readers get bored quickly, and so it's important that the visual appeal of your report keep them compelled, keep them intrigued, and keep them involved so that they can follow the flow of your reasoning right in to your opinions and conclusions. So today I'll talk about those major topic headings that are required, and I'll give you a couple of suggestions as to the major philosophy of each of the topic headings or subject headings, and some ideas as to how you can make this particular section in your report really pop and really wow the reader of the report. Okay? And I have an actual report right here. We're going to continue with what we did in our last session. So I have a report right here, and I'm going to be demonstrating the principles that I'm sharing with you today, demonstrating those by showing you the equivalent section in this report. And I'm choosing to do this way, to show you this report in front of the camera so that you can see simply how it lays out visually on the page. So you can see how it appeals to the eye of the reader as they read the hard copy of your report on written paper. Okay? Now, we could just as easily do this on the computer screen, and I could narrate in the computer screen and show you these ideas on the computer screen, but I think it's more valuable for us to do it this way here so that you can see how it lays out and how it appears on the hard copy, which is the same hard copy that's going to be received by the parties of the report. Okay, they're most likely going to be reading your report by way of hard copy versus electronically on their computer screen. So it has to have visual appeal, and it has to be attractive in hard copy format to the eye of the reader, and I'm going to give you some suggestions to make it exactly so. Okay? So let's start with our very next section. We've already gone through the introductory section. We've gone through the complexity factors, and if you missed that discussion, you should go back and watch that. But we're now beginning in the history section of our report. So here's the major topic heading, the history of the injury. Okay? Now, some doctors have different ideas as to what the history of the injury section in the report should contain. I spoke to one doctor yesterday, and he said that the history of the injury section involves only the discussion of the incident of the injury as it occurred as a singular one-time event. And then any information after that regarding the medical treatment that the examinee went through, regarding any diagnostic studies that the examinee went through, regarding any TTD that the examinee had. In other words, everything else that brings the history current up to the date of your evaluation, this doctor considered everything else to be what he referred to as subsequent medical treatment. Okay? So, whereas I'm recommending that you have one subject heading entitled the history of injury, he had two subject headings, history of injury and subsequent medical treatment of the injury. I don't have any objection to that, except to say that those two sections can easily be combined in the history of the injury section. It makes the whole report simpler. It eliminates one bolded section, and it includes everything within one section. And the fewer number of sections that we have in our report, in my opinion, is the better. And in fact, the subsequent medical history section of the report, as quoted by this doctor, does not exist in the 2016 Physician's Guide. It's not one of the formatted report elements that are described in the 2016 Physician's Guide. So I recommend that we stick exactly to the topic and subject headings that are described in the 2016 Physician's Guide. So the history of injury section of your report should describe the sequence of events as they occurred from the date of injury all the way up to the date of your evaluation, the date of your face-to-face evaluation, and everything in between. Of course, it would begin with the incident of the injury. Now, I'm recommending that you take your history of injury section and divide it into two sections. One subject heading under the history of injury section of your report reads as follows, quote, according to the medical records. And in this section, you describe the history of the injury as you derive that history of the injury from the medical records that you received. And you elaborate fully on the history of the injury from earliest dates of services, earliest events, to most recent events, right up to the date of your evaluation. Now, all of that can be done prior to the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee. So if you get the medical records 2-3 weeks ahead of time, or even 1 week ahead of time, you can go ahead and do this entire section and get familiar with the case and familiar with the medical records even before the face-to-face evaluation. Then in the second section of the history of injury section, you're going to have another subheading entitled, quote, according to Mrs. Jones. And here in this section, you give Mrs. Jones, who is your examinee, you give Mrs. Jones the opportunity to tell you the history of the injury, beginning with the date of the injury and all of the events and all of the treatment and everything that she can remember that she's been through up until the date of your evaluation. So the history of injury section is done in 2 sections. The history of injury according to the medical records and the history of injury according to the examinee. Now, there may be times when you get to the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee and you've not yet received any medical records. You've not received any medical records. Well, in that case, the 2 topic headings would reverse their position on the page, and you would begin, since it's the only information that you have in terms of history, you would begin the history of injury section of your report according to Mrs. Jones, according to the examinee, and you would take down her testimony. Then when you receive the medical records, then you could do according to the medical records section. Now, in this particular scenario where you see the examinee first and receive the medical records later, you may find some discrepancy in the medical records compared to the description of events as they were told to you by the examinee. Okay, this can happen. What should you do? Well, this has happened to me on several occasions, and this simply creates an opportunity where you must have a second face-to-face evaluation with the examinee. Now that you've received the medical records, now that you've reviewed the history as it's described in the medical records, now that you find some discrepancy between what the examinee told you and what you found in the medical records, you must pursue those inconsistencies or those discrepancies and find out what really happened, and this can only be done by a second face-to-face evaluation. So if you don't receive the medical records by the time of the face-to-face evaluation, just remember that you're hearing the story first from the mouth of the examinee and later comparing that to what's been written or documented in the medical record, and there may be some discrepancies. Okay? So this is a brilliant way to format your history of injury section, and it would look like this in your report. So this is on page 3 of the report. It starts here, it says history of injury, and history of injury is a major topic heading right here. Well, under history of injury, it says here in the middle, according to the medical records, according to the records. And herein, the doctor elaborates on the history as it's described in the medical records, summarizing the medical records from earliest events to most recent events. And then finally, he gets to the section according to Mr. Reith, according to the examinee here, and gives the examinee the opportunity to describe the history of the injury in the examinee's words now. Okay? So that's how that would look within the body of your report. Okay? And as I said, the whole section, the history according to the medical records, that can be done prior to the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee. And it should be done prior, because you should go into the evaluation fully fluent in the medical history, at least as it's described in the medical records, so that you can communicate with the examinee about specific details, and the examinee will be impressed that you remember more about his case than actually he or she does. Okay? Now, let's go on now to the relevant medical history section. That's the very next section of the report following the history of injury section, is entitled the relevant medical history. Now, in the relevant medical history, I'm recommending that you set up the relevant medical history section the same way that you set up the history of injury section, meaning in two sections. Number one, according to the medical records, and then number two, according to the examinee. Now, in the relevant medical history section of the report, what medical history is relevant? What's relevant? Is a stubbed toe in 5th grade relevant to a current concern for a right shoulder injury? No, it's not. In the relevant medical history section, you're going to describe the examinee's medical history that's relevant to the current claim for industrial injury, especially factors that may influence the apportionment determination if it's found that there's permanent impairment. So in this section of the report, you're going to want to discuss any prior industrial injuries, any prior non-industrial injuries to same or similar body parts, any prior non-industrial injuries, any subsequent industrial injuries, any subsequent non-industrial injuries, subsequent meaning subsequent to the date of the industrial injury in question. And you're going to want to find out if the examinee has ever had symptoms, injury, or treatment to the same or similar body parts that are now involved with the industrial injury. And you're searching here for history that's relevant to the current claim. You're searching for information that may impact your opinions and conclusions later on causation, meaning AOE, COE, on permanent impairment, and also on the apportionment of any permanent impairment. That would be listed here in this section. And the first part of this section, the relevant medical history section, is going to be information that you find from the medical records. So it will say, according to the medical records, and then you'll list everything that you've discovered that could be relevant to the current industrial injury. And then in the face-to-face evaluation, you're going to discuss those things that you discovered in the medical records. You're going to discuss those with the examinee and have him give you his history of each of those injuries, conditions, body parts, etc. And the conclusion of the relevant medical history is whether or not you've discovered factors that will later influence any of your opinions or conclusions. If you do find factors, you can refer the reader of the report to later sections of the report wherein you elaborate on information that you discovered in the relevant medical history. Okay? Now, let me say something else about relevant medical history. Relevant medical history is a critical section in your report because the relevant medical history relates to one of the complexity factors under ML 103 and ML 104. One of the complexity factors under ML 103 and ML 104, let me read it to you right here. One of the complexity factors, oh shoot, I don't have it here, I'm sorry. One of the complexity factors under CCR 9795 has to do with prior multiple injuries to the same body part. Prior multiple injuries to the same body part. If the examinee has had prior multiple injuries to the same body part that's currently involved in the industrial injury, then you're required to investigate those prior multiple injuries and determine if those prior multiple injuries are relevant. And if those prior multiple injuries in any way impact the current concern for industrial injury to the same body part, which it could. It could affect your whole opinion on causation, on permanent impairment, on apportionment, etc. So if you're discovering prior multiple injuries, you would elaborate on those prior multiple injuries in the relevant medical history section of your report. And this would allow you to use the complexity factor that relates to prior multiple injuries to same or similar body parts. So I hope you see how the complexity factor and the relevant medical history section of your report are interrelated, and how they should each reference each other and should each synchronize with each other, so that the prior multiple injuries complexity factor, when you use it, is well documented, and the reader of the report would agree that yes, indeed, you qualify for the use of that as a complexity factor. Okay? So relevant medical history section of your report is a critical section. It must be a masterpiece. It must be done brilliantly. It must be done in the format that I recommended to you here, and that is the top section is according to the medical records. The bottom section is according to the examinee. Okay? And that would look like this in the report. So here's the relevant medical history topic heading right here. And then herein, we comb through the medical history and the medical records to discover that this examinee has a prior medical history for many painful conditions and many different treatment modalities. So all of those issues are listed here for the reader to see. And then here is the section where the examinee has a chance to elaborate on each of these, and it's here when the examinee elaborates on those conditions that we determine whether or not those conditions are relevant with regards to the current concern with whatever body parts involved. Okay? And the relevant medical history section goes as long as it takes to cover those major categories that we talked about. Prior industrial injuries, prior non-industrial injuries, subsequent industrial injuries, subsequent non-industrial injuries, and whether or not the examinee has ever had injury or treatment to the same or similar body parts as are involved with the current industrial injury. Okay? So that's the relevant medical history. Okay? Moving on to the next section of our report is the social history. It's the social history. So we had history of the injury, relevant medical history. We're now into the social history, and then we'll get into the review of records, and then we'll take a break from this recording. Okay? Now, the social history, in my opinion, the social history, even though it's not related to any of the complexity factors, is an important section of your report, because it's in the social history section of your report that you can get to know the examinee, and you can get to know what's going on in their life, and you can get to know kind of what's their day-to-day circumstance, and you can kind of get an understanding for them as to their responsibilities, as to the extent and depth of their family, and it gives you a chance to get a look into the daily life of the examinee, which is important, especially for opinions and conclusions later on in your report, especially as those opinions may relate to activities of daily living. And I'll talk more about the social history and its intersection with your activities of daily living assessment in our very next recording. Okay? So in the social history, you want to find out a little bit about the examinee. You want to find out where they live, whether or not they're married. If they're married, do they have children? If they're not married, are they separated? Or are they divorced? And even so, do they have children? If they have children, what's the custody situation with the children? This gives you an idea as to how the examinee's Month may be broken up. May give you an idea how the examinee's week may be broken up. It may give you an idea as to how the examinee's days are broken up. Okay? You also want to find out how many of these people are living in the home. If the examinee has 4 children, how many of those are still at home? How many of those are still dependent on the home front, are still dependent upon the examinee for food, clothing, and shelter? You want to get an idea as to whether the significant other, whether that be a spouse or a fiance or simply a significant other, is that significant other working? This can give you information about the daily life of the examinee. Now, in cases where examinees are on total temporary disability, one of the important questions in the social history has to do with a typical day. So when you have an examinee on total temporary disability, you can ask him this question in the social history section of your report. You would ask him, Mrs. Jones, now that you're not working, tell me what happens in a typical day. What happens in a typical day? And you want to get them to elaborate their typical day from the moment that they get up in the morning to the moment that they wake up the very next morning. In other words, you want to get a 24-hour picture into their life and in their words. So you would take them through the activities during their day. Okay, Mrs. Jones, what time do you get up? And they'll tell you what they do when they get up. And you'll ask them, well, then what do you do? And then what do you do? And then what do you do? And you follow them throughout the course of their busy day as they go about their activities throughout their day. And generally what you'll find is that examinees that are not working are typically quite busy. In fact, it's funny, most of these examinees, while they will describe sleep difficulties, are too busy to take a nap during the day because of all the activities that they're involved in and all of the places that they're going. And so the purpose of this question is to give you an idea into the examinee's activities of daily living. And you'll find that they're quite busy and that they're able to pretty much do what it is that they want to do. And for most examinees, in my experience, most examinees are demonstrating very few limitations to activities of daily living in their day-to-day activities. And the social history section of the report is where you begin to get a sense and a feeling for their capacity for activities of daily living, which you can follow up on in later portions of the face-to-face evaluation when you go through the activities of daily living assessment with them. And I'll say a few words about the activities of daily living assessment in our very next video. Okay? So the whole social history section is brief. It looks like this in the report. Here's the topic heading, social history, and then there's some description here. And in this case, it talks about where this person lives. He's married. He does not have any hobbies. He likes to fish, but he's not really done much fishing for the last couple years. On a typical day, he gets up at around 4:30 a.m. He has to be to work at 6 a.m. He works at such and such location where he does general maintenance around the buildings and facility. On and on it goes. His shift ends at 2:30. He goes home. He has dinner at 7. He's in bed between 8 and 9. On the weekends, he picks up some odd jobs doing maintenance. He has 10 customers of his own. He sees them, and on and on. And it indicates pretty much that this examinee leads a busy, active lifestyle, including commercial jobs, commercial side jobs on the weekend. So it suggests, based on his activity level, that he has few, if any, limitations to activities of daily living. So that's a super question to include in the social history section of your report. And the question simply is, Mr. Jones, tell me what happens on a typical day for you. Tell me what you do on a typical day. Okay? So that's the social history section of the report. Okay? Now, let's just talk now about the review of records section of your report, and then we'll take a break from today's recording. Now, the next section in the report is the review of records. So here, you set the tone for the examinee in the first few sections of the report. You give them some background history as to what happened. You give them some background history as to the examinee's prior medical history. You give the reader of the report some background as to the examinee's social history and what's going on with them in their social and family life. And then, with the review of records section, we start to get a little bit technical. And we start to getting into the more technical aspects of the report, such as the physical examination, such as the occupational history, such as diagnostic studies. And from here, between this middle third of our report, I would call it, we're starting to get technical. And then in the third third of our report, we get opinionated, where we offer our opinions and conclusions. So the review of records begins the second third, the technical third, of the QME report itself. Now, the review of records must be technically perfect. It has to be technically perfect. Now, remember that review of records, 2 or more hours of review of records, is one of the complexity factors under 9795. So if you use the review of records as a complexity factor, if you want your review of records to qualify as a complexity factor, it has to be done perfectly. What is perfectly? What do I mean when I say it has to be done perfectly? What I mean is that your review of records must follow exactly the 4 labor codes and codes of regulation that govern the review of records. Now, many doctors don't know this, but there's 4 codes and regulations. I think there's 2 labor codes and 2 codes of regulation that govern the review of records section of our report. And between those 4 codes and regulations, those 4 codes and regulations tell us exactly what we must do in the review of records section of our report if we want the review of records section of our report to qualify as a complexity factor. In other words, not every review of records section of every doctor's report qualifies as a complexity factor because it's not done according to the codes and regulations that govern the review of records. I was speaking with a doctor just yesterday, and he wasn't aware of any of the 4 codes and regulations that govern the review of records, and his review of records was a mishmash, mess job. It was terrible. It was so terrible, it was embarrassing. I'm going to share with you some simple tips on how to do the review of records section of your report. Okay? Rule number 1 with the review of records. The review of records section of your report must list and summarize all the information that you received from the parties, all the information that you read related to the case, and all the information that you relied upon, keyword relied upon, in the formulation of your opinions and conclusions. So you must list and summarize all the information, especially the information that you're going to rely on later for the opinions and conclusions of your report. So this listing and summary of the review of records must be done in table format. Must be done in table format, not free on the page. The review of records must be sequestered and contained within a table on the pages of your report. This makes the records consistently listed. It makes them easy to review because they're all in the exact same formatting. And the review of records should flow in chronologic order from earliest dates to most recent dates. And can you believe that many doctors do a review of records and they don't even put the records in chronologic order? They'll have a record from 2016 here, and a record from 2015 here, and a record from 2012 here, and a record from 2017 here, and it's all over the place. It's all over the place. No, the review of records must be done in chronologic order to show the reader the sequence of events that occurred from earliest dates to most recent dates, just as those events occurred in real time. And the records, as you summarize the records, what do you want to focus on in the summary of your records? Well, many doctors don't summarize the records. They do something that's extremely obnoxious. And that is, they recapitulate the entirety of the document within the review of records. They'll include information such as physical exam findings, degrees of abduction, all kind of unrelated verbiage from the entirety of the medical record that they reviewed. And we're not asking you in the review of records section of your report to recapitulate the entirety of documents. And the records are reviewed chronologically with the date in the left-hand column, and then any review and summary in the column to the right, with each date of service getting its own cell within the table of the review. And because this case had many, many records, you can see that the table continues for several pages. Now, in the review of records, once you've reviewed all the records, eventually that will bring you to the time or the date of your evaluation. And there will be some records that you'll list here in your review of records that relates to documents that you used in your evaluation. So, for example, in this report, you can see right here at the bottom of the table here, on the date of the evaluation here, the examinee went through many, many questionnaires, and each of those questionnaires are listed here in the review of records. Okay, so list all the information, documentation that you generate as part of your evaluation here also in the review of records section of your report. And then generally the very last entry on the table of the review of records has to do with any diagnostic studies that you may have ordered after you saw the examinee face to face. Okay, so the review of records goes from earliest events in time to most recent events in time, and the most recent events in time would be your evaluation, all the questionnaires you used in your evaluation, and then also any diagnostic studies that you ordered as a part of your evaluation. Okay, so the review of records section of your report, because review of records is a complexity factor under 9795, if you're going to use the complexity factor, then the review of records section of your report should be a masterpiece. It should be perfect. I mean, imagine being a claims administrator and receiving a QME report with billing at the ML103 or ML104 level for review of records as one of the complexity factors. What are you going to do as the claims administrator? You're going to go right to the review of records section, and you're going to see, what's this doctor billing me 3, 4, 5, 6 hours for a review of records? Let's see the review of records section of the report. And when the reader of the report looks at the review of records section of your report, they should easily get it that the amount of time that you're billing for is exactly what it took to produce this masterpiece table that exactly complies with 4 labor codes and regulations, and that lists all the medical records in chronologic order and extracts from those medical records the information that you're going to review and especially rely upon for your opinions and conclusions later. And it should look absolutely beautiful as this one does. There are no typos. It's perfectly formatted. You can see that it has interior bullets to go through several descriptions. It includes brief summaries where it's applicable. It does not recapitulate the entirety of documents. And the review of records section is not just an add-on section. It's not just an ancillary section. It's a critical section. It's like the table of index for your report, because later on in your opinions and conclusions, you're going to refer back many, many times to the review of records for the relevant facts that support your opinions and conclusions. So critical section, and I believe these points will help ramp up the review of records section of your report. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. In our next video, we're going to continue with additional sections of our report, including the occupational history, the activities of daily living, the current symptoms, and we'll get into the physical examination as well. So this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I want to thank you for taking the time to join me, and look forward to being with you in our very next video in just a couple days.